Professor Ginsburg, thank you so very much for joining our interview series.
It's my pleasure to be here. I think it's important work you're doing.
Thank you. Let me start right away with the first question. You argue that there's a strong possibility that 21st century will be known more as an authoritarian century than a democratic one. What are the reasons for this assumption, and what impact rising authoritarianism will have on international law? Additionally, what do you think are the primary factors contributing to the global trend of democratic backsliding and constitutional erosion? And how do you see it impacting the future of global constitutionalism?
Wow, that's so many questions. And so let me just start by saying that, obviously in the last 3 decades, we've thought of democracy as being, something that emerged kind of in like modernization theory. Like, yes, we acknowledge that most governments in most of human history have been undemocratic, have been authoritarian. But, after the end of the Cold War, it seemed that democracy was ascendant, the so-called third wave of democratization, as Sam Huntington put it. And so it seemed as if democracy was, as they used to say, the only game in town. And of course, from where we sit now, that just seems like not only a naive assumption, but instead, democracies seem to be something like a blip, a historical blip, in some sense, because now the world seems to be reverting to its natural state of violent conflict and authoritarianism. Now, I would disagree with the simplicity of that assumption, by the way. I think that it is still the case that the richest, most powerful, most successful countries, the countries which deliver public goods to their citizens, are grounded in the will of the people. You have a few very high-performing non-democracies or limited democracies that do that as well, like Singapore, for example, what would be a wonderful place to be born if you had to pick where you were going to be born. And so in those countries, for whatever reason, there's a responsive kind of authoritarianism. But in general, of course, if you can choose, you do want to be born in a democracy, I think, because they tend to, despite all of their ugliness and problems, democracies always feel like they're existentially challenged precisely because we can express our feelings of disappointment in our leaders. Despite that feeling, they are still, very high performing on most any indicator one would want to choose. Authoritarianism, sometimes there's like a naivete about it. Oh, I wish we just need a dictator to make the trains run on time. The problem is, for every Singapore, there's a Cambodia in 1975 or something. You know what I mean? For every high-performing authoritarian regime, there are some really, really horrible ones. And the search for a strongman, and this affects your theme of populism, it goes to that. The desire for a strongman to fix it is almost always extremely naive. I point to the case of Tunisia now, which has a kind of lame strongman who took over, a constitutional lawyer, believe it or not, who took over after there was so much disappointment in the economic performance of the democracy. And you know what? It's a stagnant situation and it's not good. People aren't better off. So in general, I'm a fan of democracy. I think that democracy will continue in the countries where it is most established, but it is fraying, and there's a feeling of existential problem. Now, you asked a question about like, why are we seeing democratic backsliding and such? And there's so many, things to point to there. One claim is that rising polarization contributes to backsliding. That is, if see you, my political opponent, not just as someone who I disagree with on policy, but as someone who existentially threatens me, threatens the things that are important to me, that is the enemy, well, then I'm likely to try to take over the institutions and do that before you do. And so what it leads is kind of a escalation in democratic competition to erode the fundamental bases of the institutions that are necessary to make democracy work. So polarization is itself a big cause. And polarization, we think a lot of it is the social media and such that has really put people into buckets. I'm heartened, by the way, in the United States, that the people are less polarized than their leaders. There's many areas of policy where the people actually agree And so I'm not one of the more hysterical analysts of the United States. You have some people saying, oh my God, there's going to be a civil war. There's not going to be a civil war in the United States. It's not going to happen. Many of us have family on the other side. We're not going to kill each other over Donald Trump or something. That's not happening. But there is this kind of, sense in which the politics are extremely polarized, and that has a lot of complex reasons, including the way we draw districts, including the social media and other things. So there's a kind of trend generally in many societies, and then there's specific things to a country like the United States. Now, you asked another part of your question was about authoritarianism and international law. And so what would the rising number of authoritarian regimes in the world, how might that change international law? And there, I think, indeed, it is changing, very rapidly in front of our eyes. I say I wrote an article a few years ago called Authoritarian International Law, and actually a little book called Democracies in International Law. And in that book, I pointed out the fact that authoritarians and democracies use international law in different ways. That is, you're in Europe, and your whole European Union, in some sense, grew out of an international legal arrangement that was genuinely able to provide public goods for people on a continent-wide basis. I know people are criticizing it, but still, it's an amazing achievement. That's cooperation across borders, the giving up of sovereignty, the commitment to human rights and such. And authoritarians, of course, aren't interested in much of that, mainly because they don't trust each other. They don't, they're not able to engage in deep cooperation. They barely trust their own inner circle. So it's very hard for them to engage in serious acts of trust and bilateral cooperation. So it's a kind of thinner cooperation. But what we see when we look at the institutions and norms of international law is something that, a pattern that I identify, which is democracies innovate in governance. Democracies come up with new ideas, new institutions. Transparency, Freedom of Information Acts, administrative law, citizens' assemblies. All these things are democratic innovations. Authoritarians see those things and copy them, and then repurpose them for their own purpose. And that's exactly what we're seeing in international law. We see the Human Rights Council taken over by a bunch of authoritarian regimes, and then, of course, their main interest is not to have any criticism of themselves. We see the General Assembly, of course, is now at this point a majority authoritarian institution. And, it's degrading in some sense some of the highest ideals of international law. And then we see some doublespeak. Russia claims that there's a special military operation going on in Ukraine and it's defense against genocide by the Ukrainians. Well, the exact opposite is the case. And so, that kind of repurposing is meant to confuse one's own citizens, but also to just, throw arguments out there that, and in the end, it does degrade the possibility of deep cooperation. So you asked a lot of questions. I gave a lot of answers very quickly, so I hope it's not too much.
Indeed, Professor Ginsburg, thank you. You mentioned the blurred distinction between democratic backsliding and breakdown in your article, The Value of Tyrannophobia. How important is it for scholars and policymakers to clearly differentiate between the two, and what criteria should be used to make this distinction effectively?
This is such a great question. I think even talking now in 2024 versus talking 6 years ago or so, or I think I wrote that article a little bit, I can't remember exactly when, but, I think our perspective has to change a little bit. Democratic backsliding, it turns out, is common. There are many episodes where democracies, degrade in the quality of their institutions and in their self-perception. A democratic breakdown, meaning the end of democracy, is actually pretty rare for countries like yours and mine. That is, countries which are rich and have been democratic for a long time tend not to actually break down. Adam Jaworski, the great scholar at NYU, calculated the probability of a country as rich and with a democratic history of the United States of democracy ending as basically being infinitesimal. And I think he's right. That is, we will remain a democratic country no matter what. France will remain a democratic country no matter what. The electoral mechanism will work. There will be, basic components of the rule of law, even if it's degraded. But the quality of those things could decline. And you could have, in my country, which is a federal country, instances of what we call subnational authoritarianism, which is a thing in the literature. And that's something we, of course, had for 100 years. So between the end of the Civil War and 1964, the Civil Rights Act, by 1965, the Voting Rights Act, the entire South of the United States was not a democracy because Black people couldn't vote because of some various legal mechanisms that the majority implemented. So that meant the United States as a whole might have been a democracy, but we weren't a very good one because you had whole regions which weren't. That kind of thing could happen again here in the United States. States are very, very powerful in our system. And so you could get pockets of subnational authoritarianism, but I don't see a true breakdown here. Breakdowns, and in general, like when you think about the vast scope of, last 150 years, how does democracy break down? Well, basically war, if you're taken over, revolution, if you have some sort of communist revolution or something like that, and then a military coup. Those are the mechanisms. And I don't see any of those things happening in your country or mine. There's a lot of revolutionaries out there, but they have no social base. It's mostly people on the hard left in universities in my country talking a good game. But that's not going to happen. And we're never going to have a military coup in this country. Civil military relations are very much under control. And even if there's a lot of discussion about Donald Trump and what his intentions are and such. And so I have a particular view about that. But I don't see any world in which he orders the military to stop us from having elections. So basically, I think the oldest, strongest democracies are subject to backsliding, clearly. But we're not really at risk of serious breakdown, in my opinion.
All right. In your article, How Authoritarians Use International Law, you underline that democracies have produced the grandest legal achievements, including the European integration and the development of global trade regime. You clearly see European Union as a great success. How do you explain the rise of far-right parties and their recent successes in elections in the founding members of EU like France, Italy, and the Netherlands?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I happen to have been living in Europe when the euro was introduced in 2000. And it was very interesting because you found there wasn't a lot of, popular discussion of it. For most people, most ordinary people, that I was living in the Netherlands, the ordinary folks didn't like it much. It led to inflation, and that led to some resentment about the euro. And there was a sense that this decision had been taken by the government without much sort of popular sense. A lot of people talk about the failure of Europe to develop a demos, a true kind of sense of a continent-wide polity, and that the project in some sense was a technocratic and elitist one. And I think that's right. It doesn't work to have Valéry Giscard d'Estaing giving you a constitution from on high. People rejected that, and they rightly did. It doesn't have the social base that is needed to sustain it. At the same time, on the economic side, it's been so massively successful. It is the major global regulatory power. It has made people, they might not feel it, but it has made people wealthier than they would otherwise be. And, it's at the political level that it does not seem to have the legitimacy that it needs to. And it's natural, well, I shouldn't say natural. The nation state the idea that it would go away was naive. It was very naive. I remember reading some things in the late 1990s, early 2000s by Professor Anne-Marie Slaughter and others who were celebrating the European project, and they thought an ever closer union, this is just going to keep going like a machine that's going of itself. And I was very skeptical, first of all, that had any application outside Europe, because I study East Asia, and there's just like no sense in which China and Japan are going to give up their national consciousness. It would never, ever happen. But even in Europe, I was somewhat skeptical because I did kind of recognize this lack of a demos, a lack of European feeling during my visits there. You go to Italy, people still say, I'm Italian. No one's introducing themselves as a European, except for the people who are working for the EU in Brussels. So, all right, so what does that mean? Look, the nationalist backlash is healthy. We have to admit it. We can't say it's some kind of pathology. It is a real feeling in society. And this is always true, I'd say, since you're studying populism, I think it's important in our discussions of populism to recognize that. Populism is not some disease we're going to cure. Populism is a natural political development that happens when elites are too out of touch. And so that's one reason that we see it, these far-right parties rising in Europe. And to me, the critical thing is not, there's no problem running as a populist. In fact, in the United States, we have a long tradition of this. Every politician runs against Washington, D.C. George W. Bush did, Barack Obama, of course, Trump. Everyone does that. But the key thing is once you get into office, you can't govern like a populist. Running like a populist is different than governing like a populist. And here, I'm not an expert, and you maybe can tell me more. To me, the government of Meloni in Italy is an interesting one, because clearly she's kind of a populist in some sense, and she's a far-right party. And yet what I see is far-right policies, but not really governing as a populist in the sense of trying to destroy the institutional structure of the country. In fact, the institutional structure constrains her as it has everyone in post-war Italy. And we all know that Italian, constitutional order has got a lot of pathologies, a lot of problems that they just can never fix. And it's going to constrain her as well. So a big point being, I think we have to distinguish between running as populist, which is good and healthy, and governing as a populist, which is bad, and could ultimately really degrade the quality of democratic institutions. Can I say one more word about it? In my book with Aziz Huq in 2018, How to Save a Constitutional Democracy, we distinguish the forces that are leading to democratic backsliding. And we have one we call partisan degradation. But the key one for this discussion is charismatic populism. And Donald Trump embodies it. Someone who comes along and says, I alone can fix all of this. I intuit what the people say. I know what the people say. And any institution between me and the people, we have to get rid of. That kind of rhetoric can lead to action which destroys institutions. And the fact at the end of the day is for constitutional democracy to succeed, you need institutions. So that's why I don't like governing as a populist.
Mm-hmm. The concept of authoritarian constitutionalism has gained traction in the academic literature, describing regimes that use constitutional tools to consolidate power. How do you distinguish between genuine constitutionalism and its authoritarian use, and what role do international and domestic actors play in challenging and supporting these regimes?
It's interesting. Well, first of all, I do think you could call it authoritarian constitutionalism. It can be a genuine form of constitutionalism. Like, Britain until the Reform Act of 1832 was a constitutional system, small c constitutional system, even though it wasn't a democratic one. And, I guess I think that we should, there's liberal constitutional democracy, which is itself its own pretty rare phenomenon. But just because you're not in that bucket doesn't mean that there's no constitutionalism. You can still have constrained power. I mean, one of the countries I study is Thailand. Thailand is not a strong, certainly not a democracy at this point. They are banning political parties and things like this. And yet, the military-backed leader who served as prime minister stepped down after 8 years as the Constitution required. That is, the text is still constraining power holders on important things. And that is a form of constitutionalism, even if it's not liberal constitutionalism. So, that's the way I think about those distinctions. Mark Tushnet had an article a few years ago, Authoritarian Constitutionalism, which was about Singapore. I didn't think that was a very good case for him. Basically what he meant is a regime which isn't too bad and is still authoritarian. But, constitutionalism, I guess, requires a little deeper examination of the actual mechanisms at play. the role of the constraining institutions and stuff. And it's a wonderful thing to study. I mean, there's so many interesting variations. In some sense, what is the old Tolstoy expression? Every happy family's alike, every unhappy family's unhappy in its own way. The varieties of authoritarian constitutional arrangements are very, very many, maybe more diverse than those of constitutional democracy. So in any case, I think that's a really interesting set of questions. On the role of the international community here, I have a very thin view of international law. I don't think that I certainly don't think there's a right to democracy in international law. I think states are required by the terms of international law to be, obey basic human rights and such clearly. But you don't have to have a democratic system, and it would be very bad for international law to itself require that, because all of a sudden you have many members of the international community which are sort of putatively illegitimate. How can we deal with them when we know that they are in fact historically the vast majority of human government arrangements? So what does that mean? What should international law do? Well, it's a big question. I do think that we have some record of some success and of international arrangements sort of keeping backsliding democracies from going too far off the rails, holding some authoritarian regimes to account. And here, I suppose one example might be the situation in Poland. Since the Law and Justice Party came to power, as they were engaged in institutional escalation. They took over the court system, and that created problems for European law because of the demand for mutual recognition of judgments and things like this, and the insistence that judicial independence and the rule of law were core European values. And there was a process. There's an Article 7 process that went forward. Article 2 as well was used, but it didn't get very far in terms of constraining the law and justice government. But what it did do is keep the situation, I think, from going too far off the rails. They might have gone much further, much faster had they not been in the European Union. And that meant that, the opposition was given some space to organize, and eventually they did win this election. Probably law and justice will come back at some point. But the point is that, democracy did not end in Poland. Hungary is a different story, of course. We don't really know, but this playing field seems extremely slanted in that country. And it may be that, Viktor Orban doesn't leave power for the rest of his life. That's a plausible scenario. Fortunately, the Europeans kind of, that woke them up, I think. But you have other examples in Latin America and in Africa where, courts do play a role around the edges. They're not going to save democracy, but they can keep space alive for oppositions to organize and to keep the worst results from happening, to keep from turning into one of the truly awful dictatorships that history has given us too many examples of.
Right. In your article, How Authoritarians Use International Law, you discuss how authoritarian regimes are increasingly using international law to legitimize their rule and shield themselves from criticism. How effective has this strategy been in reshaping international norms? And what can democratic states do to counter this manipulation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think that we are seeing, the manipulation of international law, certainly. Well, we're seeing sort of a explicitly authoritarian cooperation, say, in something like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or the Eurasian institutions that Vladimir Putin set up as a counterweight to the European Union. One of the things they do is that they cooperate with each other on their internal security problems. So one of my examples in the article is the creation of a new international norm, a new term, extremism and separatism. These are now crimes in international law in that part of the world. They're defined by a set of countries, and there's enforcement machinery, so that if I as a government name you as a separatist or an extremist, whatever that is, then other countries have to arrest you and extradite you. And extremism, includes things like advocating for LGBT rights. Separatism can be, saying, well, we'd like some autonomous government in Tibet or something like that. Not even calling for secession. So all of those kind of things they're new norms, and they actually are having teeth. So that's something to watch, because what it means is the international legal system is being used to strengthen domestic dictatorships and to bind them more closely together in their common projects. Then the other thing I think we have to worry about is the degradation of other norms, like the human rights norms. Human rights with Chinese characteristics. I mentioned before the Human Rights Council, the questions that they focus on, the examples they give. One example might be the issue that came before the Human Rights Council several years ago, maybe over a decade ago, a proposal for a norm against the defamation of religion. So defamation, of course, is an individual level crime. If you say something false about me, I can get a kind of a judgment against you. This would have included anyone who denigrated Islam, the holy religion of Islam, or Judaism or Christianity, but Islam was the main driving force. Well, that is not consistent with a democratic, norm of free speech. And that's something where I think we see like the subtle change of terms. Now, all of a sudden, the object of human rights is not humans, or the subject of human rights is not humans, but religions. That's a strange thing. What does that even mean? Who speaks for the religion? So that's the kind of thing I think we're seeing, very subtle in some cases, but it bears very close watching. The last thing I'd say is the international legal institutions. There was an attempt by, we see the abuse of Interpol, for example, the transnational policing agency, where authoritarians will issue red notices to their political opponents who've done no real crime. And that means, under those protocols, that those people have to be arrested anywhere in the world. Well, that obviously is an abuse of international institutions and something that makes it really important who's running Interpol. The Chinese government had moved very, very far towards taking over that institution in some sense. And the Western powers were kind of asleep at the wheel. But I think now they've woken up and realized that you can't, have something like Interpol become politicized and authoritarian. So that's why this requires zealous awareness and advocacy and the Western powers to wake up sometimes.
All right. How could a possible Trump victory on November the 5th impact American democracy? There are those who are very concerned, and there are those who argue that American democracy will survive another Trump administration. Where do you stand at this debate?
Oh, that's such a great question. So I have two views. So the first thing is people in the United States tend not to look at the rest of the world. As you know, we're very arrogant and we don't look at the other countries' experience. But I think when you do look at other countries' experience, we should be very, very worried, because when you look around the world at some of the forces which have really attacked democratic institutions and have degraded democracy, many of them had a first term in power which wasn't so bad. So you have some people saying, Trump, we survived him once. It's no problem. The institutions held. Well, think about Viktor Orban. He governed before his second government. He governed as kind of a reasonable nationalist figure. Kaczynski was in power with his brother and, showed no signs of trying to take over the country's institutions. Narendra Modi, it's his first time in power, but the BJP did have a term in government under Vajpayee, and they were kind of a normal party. And then the second time around, all of these forces learned. In other words, they learned about the machinery of government and they attacked it with more vigor and more efficacy. So I think from that point of view, we should be very, very worried. But here, we have to think about, well, who is this character and what is his motivations? And the Supreme Court has been very helpful to Trump. They've prevented him from, they've given him a very expansive notion of immunity now. They allowed him to be on the ballot despite some efforts by some states to keep him off the ballot. And, you know, they were not going to be much of a constraint on him. But what is the actual things he's threatening to do? I think he is certainly going to use the justice system to go after his political opponents. No question. He says he's going to do that, so we might as well believe him. And here, then, we have to really examine, like, what is the justice system? Is it capable of withstanding that kind of politicization? I think in the end, it is, but I wouldn't want to be one of his political opponents. So the way it works here is that he can direct the prosecutors, the national prosecutors, and they have norms of independence, but they're just norms. So he'll be able to say to them, you know, I want you to prosecute Biden or I'm going to fire you. And if they say no, they get fired and someone comes in who's willing to do it. So I think that kind of thing is going to happen. The question is it going to work? It's going to cost whoever gets prosecuted a lot of money, and it's got a lot of harassment value, and it degrades our view of the legal system. So it's a terrible thing. But at the end of the day, in this country, you have to have the judges and you have to have a jury, you know, to be convicted. And I don't see fake charges getting very far. Trump has appointed a lot of judges, but so has Biden. Biden has been very, very quick at appointing judges. And at this point, about half of the appeals court judges were appointed by Democrats and half by Republicans. The lower courts are more appointed by Democrats. So the judges are not partisan in the sense they're just going to say whatever Donald Trump says is going to happen. And you have to pass a jury. So I think we're going to see that kind of thing. I don't expect him to try to stay on for power after 4 more years. He's old. His kids, you know, he might want his kids to run. And if you try to stay on after 4 years, you're going to ruin that possibility. And I just don't see that being as part of his motivation. So, you know, what is my biggest fear? My biggest fears are policy fears. Immigration, I mean, really, it's going to be very, very ugly. And they promise to, you know, have big camps for immigrants and round people up. So that's going to be very ugly. We don't want to see that. It's not actually anti-democratic. You know, I hate to say it. It's maybe against human rights, but it's not anti-democratic because it's a popular policy. I worry about the administrative state. In other words, that they will discourage people who are you know, the bureaucrats who work for the Environment Agency. They'll be so depressed, they're all going to quit, and the state capacity will be reduced. And that's really bad for democracy. But I don't see democracy ending. So in some sense, I have a mixed answer. I shouldn't tell the world how I'm going to vote, but let's just say I'm not the biggest Donald Trump fan. And I do worry, and precisely because I worry about American democratic institutions. I think he is not good for them, but I don't think he will end them. That's my view. And that being said, it also requires like vigilance. One other last thing to say about this is we're a federal country. That means most law enforcement is local and state. Most, you know, and the states are very divided. California, I think, is a bigger economy than France. It's, you know, there's very little Donald Trump can do to change what happens there, you know, in any kind of big way. So democracy will survive.
Lastly, Professor Ginsburg, in your recent article published at Persuasion, titled "Trump is Gearing Up for Lawfare," you argue that Trump, if elected, will instrumentalize and politicize the prosecution. In a system of solid check and balances, how can Trump possibly achieve his goal?
This is a great question. I started to answer it a little bit before, but let me go into more depth. So under the President Richard Nixon, who was involved in the Watergate scandal where he was spying on his opponents, he you know, wanted his prosecutors to be obedient. And so he fired them until they were going to obey the rules. And eventually they got one who said, no, I'm not going. And, you know, actually, it was after Nixon resigned that a new prosecutor came in, an attorney general, who wanted to restore the dignity of the office. And one of the things they set up was very detailed internal rules before a prosecution could happen at the federal level. And those are internal norms of the Justice Department and internal rules of the Justice Department. Now, a president like Trump does have the authority to hire an attorney general and to fire him at will. And so I think he's going to choose someone who's going to overrule some of those things to get some key prosecutions, Biden, for example. But the law does constrain, and I think that there's limits to what can be done there. I think my bigger fear, I mean, that would, by the way, that would be very bad for the morale of the Justice Department. These norms that are in place, I think, are pretty good. They're sort of a check, and even if they're not legally enshrined. I think my bigger fear is something that we've already seen on the Democratic side. In New York State, you had the Attorney General running for office saying, I'm going to prosecute Donald Trump. And she did get a judgment against him. There was also the New York City attorney, Alvin Bragg, who prosecuted him on the fraud case and won. So Donald Trump is a convicted criminal, the first time that someone like that's ever run for office. I'm not a big fan of that prosecution. I don't think it was a good idea. The reason is, if I was to take any random American and say, what was he prosecuted for? They wouldn't be able to explain it. If I was to get a lawyer, the theory is really, really a stretch. And technically, yes, it was a violation of the law. But the reason I'm not a fan of that is I don't want the state prosecution offices to get involved in harassing presidents, even when they do some things that are wrong. In this sense, I believe, and it's a controversial thing to say, that presidents should get a little more room than the ordinary citizen in terms of the crimes. And the reason is that we have another mechanism of accountability, the political one, right? The law cannot substitute for political accountability, and sometimes attempts to pursue legal accountability actually undermine political accountability. You know, if the public wants to elect someone who has committed a crime like Donald Trump, they're going to do it. And when you have these prosecutions that no one understands, actually what that ends up doing is hurting the vision of the people's perception of the prosecution. So I worry about these state level ones. And I think if Trump, you know, is unsuccessful at prosecuting Biden, you're still going to get some prosecutions at the state level, perhaps. And, you know, that's just not good. It just weaponizes the justice system. And there are many countries, as you know, where this, once you start that, it's hard to put it back in the box. So I do worry.
Professor Ginsburg, thank you so very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you today, and look forward to watching more of your work.
Thank you so much.